12. Washington, D.C., December 2021. Boris Pavlov's phone rang as he was about to go out to lunch. Caller was not registered in the number book. He chose not to answer as he usually does in such cases. Soon after, the same number called again. What persistence is this? This time he was reluctantly hungry. Hello? No answer. Just as Boris was about to hang up, a young woman began to speak in a slightly trembling voice. Am I talking to Major Pavlov? Boris, on the one hand, signaled to his secretary that he was out to lunch, answered the worried woman on the phone. Yes, it's me. Who are you? Selina wasn't sure exactly how she should express herself to the man in front of her, nor would she be taken seriously. So she tried to choose his words carefully. Mr. Pavlov, I am the wife of Colonel Armstrong who died about a month ago. I don't know if you were aware of the incident. And well, who Colonel is? Boris replied, thinking for a few seconds. No, frankly I don't think so. The young woman hesitated in the face of the police, who spoke briefly and clearly. Look, I must meet you. I think my husband was murdered. Boris was confused. Look, ma'am, I'm really sorry for your loss, but I'm not the one you need to contact in a situation like this. I also couldn't understand why you had this conversation a month after your husband's death. Selina continued, sighing. Mr. Pavlov, I understand your reaction in this way. But on the day of the incident, it was procedurally reported to the police and has already been investigated. The cause of death was recorded as a heart attack and the case was closed. Young woman gave the impression of being quite sincere and persistent. I understand. So why are you specifically calling me? And what did you mean by do you know who my husband was? Boris looked at his watch. I can't explain it on the phone. But believe me, I have valid reasons. There are also things you need to see in person. You will understand better when you see them. If possible, can we meet face to face today? Boris paused for a moment. He was intrigued by the incident. All right, Mrs. Armstrong. Is 1900 hours tonight right for you? Yes, it's appropriate. Can you come to the WBI building? Sure. Good. I share my location. See you soon. At exactly 7 p.m. that evening, Selina was waiting for Boris parked in front of the WBI building. 10 minutes later, Boris showed up. After a brief introduction, they went to Boris's car and went to the modest restaurant called Bundle Kitchen, which had recently opened. After ordering something, Selina got on the subject. Thank you for your time. I will try to give as short and understandable an explanation as possible. Boris looked at the tired and sad beautiful young woman, who was evident from her gaze, which she had not slept much lately. He didn't know what to think of this strange meeting and the woman in front of him. You're welcome, I'm listening to you. Selina took out of her bag the newspaper page that Colonel had hidden and opened it. At the same time she continued. Look, Mr. Pavlov, my husband, Colonel Armstrong, was Neil Armstrong's grandson. Boris tried to hide his surprise. I found out about this a while after I met him. Colonel always preferred to stay out of sight when he had the opportunity to lead a rather ostentatious life. He always had an attitude of running away from things. He was very intellectual. He was interested in different subjects. For example, art, philosophy, history of religions, mathematics, archaeology, antiquarianism. He was also a person who impressed people with his appearance and speeches, but after his university years, he immersed himself in books and personal interests, and kept his social life extremely limited. Even though his grandfather was one of the most important men in recent history, he deliberately avoided talking about it. The last few months before his death were also particularly restless. To his melancholic temperament were added such things as nightmares, stomach spasms, and more than usual, being buried in his research. Selina fingered at the news of Simon Blake and Boris Pavlov on the newspaper page she had laid out on the table. Boris looked at it in amazement. I remember this news. My close friend Simon and I had illuminated an interesting case. What do you think this has to do with our topic? He smiled. Selina then summed up what happened on the evening of Colonel's car accident. To make room for the waiter who brought the orders at the time, Boris pulled his head back from the table he was leaning to, while Selina tidied up the newspaper. Boris asked Selina a question he himself had guessed the answer to, because he was curious about the woman's reaction. Colonel believed that what was going to happen to him and the events behind it would be brought to light through this newspaper report. In other words, he thought that me, my friend Simon, and that David would solve this case. Do you know who that David is? Boris was eating his food while waiting for Selina's response. I think yes. I think he meant David Brewster. David has been with us for years. He worked under Colonel in all sorts of positions. But he was more like a family friend than an employee. He and Colonel were very close and his death affected him a lot. Boris swallowed the bite in his mouth. And have you discussed this with David Brewster? Selina, who was not considered a very appetizing person in normal times, had stopped eating since the day she lost her husband. Me situation looked no different tonight. No, Major Pavlov, not yet. She has concerns about Brewster. Instead of someone she says she's been close to for years, she's bringing it up to someone she's never met, like me. Or she's lying to me. Pavlov, gazing at the young woman, said, I understand. Mr. Pavlov, can you tell me about your friend Simon Blake? Boris rolled his eyes. What exactly do you want to know, Miss Armstrong? He asked. I did research on your friend before I came to meet you. Or rather, let's say I browsed the internet to satisfy my curiosity. I did not come across any important information other than that he was a faculty member in the art history branch at the University of Washington. How can such a person play a key role in criminal cases? And as intriguing as the subject of spontaneous combustion in the newspaper report is, at least as far as I know, it is far outside Mr. Blake's area of expertise. But the newspaper says that he received an award for this from the university where he worked? Major Pavlov paused for a moment, being careful not to tell more than necessary to the young woman he had known for a short time, and answered the question. Simon is a little extraordinary. Coincidentally, 3 years ago, they were of considerable help in clarifying an issue concerning the police. But Simon is a busy person. I don't know why your husband specifically leaked my name and my friend's name. I think for now, let's look at what we can do without involving him. May I ask you to summarize what happened the morning your husband died? Part 14. Florida, 1969. After the disaster that took place about 17 months ago, the NASA team quickly recovered, the Apollo program was completely overhauled and rebuilt, all kinds of security measures were increased, and an evacuation hatch was added to the command module, which this time opened within 3 seconds. July 16, 1969 at 9:32 a.m. At Cape Kennedy Space Base in Merritt Island, Florida, Apollo 11, mounted on a massive 363-foot Saturn V rocket, began its journey smoothly, this time with a crew consisting of Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin. 7.5 million pounds of thrust pumps were used for the launch. Apollo 11 would enter lunar orbit after a journey of about 12 hours. The publicly disclosed justification for the trip to the moon was from the very beginning, mankind's scientific curiosity and the U.S. rivalry with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. It would remain so for much of the world. Part 15. Selina summed up to Major Pavlov what happened on the morning of her husband's death and its aftermath. Colonel had lately been obsessively interested in the fact that written history did not reflect the facts, and had been studying the old sources he could find on this subject until late. I think he was last interested in a book written by Francis Bacon in the 1600s. He had contacted someone in Georgetown, Texas, who claimed that the original version of the book had different information than the version that had been released. He got up early that morning, around 4 o'clock. I think, and set off. It didn't wake me up. He had told me the night before that he had bought a plane ticket for 6:30 a.m. He was going to take a taxi to Reagan Airport and fly to Georgetown. Selina's voice began to tremble and her eyes began to blush. She was holding herself hard not to cry. With a deep sigh, she continued. Around 6 a.m., they called Peace Health St. Martin Medical Center to inform me that my husband had suddenly suffered a heart attack while traveling in a taxi and that despite all efforts, they could not save him. Hospital security briefly detained the taxi driver and asked him a few questions, then leave him because he didn't see anything suspicious. Have they checked the identity of the taxi driver and the company he is affiliated with? Yes, they did. From what they told me, there didn't seem to be any problems. Go ahead, please. The incident was recorded as a death due to a heart attack, and they said they did not find any evidence to suspect that there was a criminal element involved. In the days that followed, I went to the police to express my suspicions and asked for an autopsy, but they dismissed it as the imagination of a young woman who had just lost her husband. You know the aftermath. I understand, Miss Armstrong. Is there anything you'd like to add other than all that? Even if it seems trivial or irrelevant to you, what is something that seems strange to you in your husband's behavior lately? Me young woman thought for a while. Could be Mr. Pavlov. As I mentioned earlier, my husband's sleep patterns had been disrupted in recent months. Sometimes he would slump in his sleep, and sometimes he would wake up jumping suddenly. I noticed that it was a phrase that he often repeated in his sleep at times like this, but I didn't think it could be important until you asked. What is it, Mrs. Armstrong? Noah's flood. Part 16. Washington, D.C., January 2022. Simon Blake was presenting interdisciplinary art to senior undergraduate students at the Washington University School of Art in Seattle, where he had been an associate professor for the past 4 years, for the first time that day with the title of professor. It couldn't be said that he was too excited. His mouth was dry as he had been talking non-stop for half an hour, so he took a sip of water from the PET bottle that had been placed for him on the lectern and continued to explain, pointing to the image projected by the projection machine with the stick he was holding. As you can see in his work print gallery, Moritz Escher has dealt with what we call the Droste effect in a genius way that no artist has ever thought of before. Escher, who became part of popular culture in a way after his death, has many striking drawings that almost everyone is familiar with. But the print gallery is perhaps the most important work of the artist, if not one of his best-known works, such as Metamorphosis or Relativity. The students in the hall did not seem to be impressed by the strange curvilinear drawings projected on the screen and the black and white drawing, which consisted of a child figure looking at them. Me Too schoolgirls chuckled, looking at Professor Blake and then at each other. There began to be howls from the hall, which evidently did not have a discussion about the content of the lesson. Just as Blake expected. Then Simon Blake hit play button. Immediately afterwards, the drawing, which did not give the impression of an artistic masterpiece on the screen, began to rotate slightly. As the image rotated within itself, it had the effect of being similar to the way passengers traveling inside a tunnel approached the exit of the tunnel. The image that rotated and expanded as it approached the central point formed the big picture itself in the form of repetitions that continued each time and forever. The students in their own world, who a few seconds earlier were not so excited about the presentation, were silently locked into the screen as if hypnotized. Then laughing and applause began to come from the hall, indicating surprise and satisfaction. Smiling slightly, Blake gestured with his hand to the students to be quiet and stopped the image again. I think it's a little better understood now why this work is a masterpiece. A buzzing yes sounded from the hall. A male student in glasses raised his hand and took the floor. It's clear that this is a genius study, Dr. Blake. But don't you think the artistic aspect is a bit weak? I think it's more like an engineering work than an artistic masterpiece. You made a very correct point. It was precisely at this point that Escher was harshly criticized by his contemporaries. In response, he says that the issue of what is exciting is a purely subjective one, and that these are the issues that affect him. Moreover, the interaction between mathematics and the plastic arts is not something that Escher explored, but rather dates back to the beginning of art history. These two disciplines have influenced and transformed each other in the course of history. Another student took the floor. Did Escher make use of computers during this work? At the time of the study, personal computers were not yet common. However, in recent years, the infrastructure of this drawing has been formulated by reverse engineering using various computer programs, so that different versions can be made. Another student asked, "Why do you think Escher was so obsessed with math? What was his purpose?" I doubt there is a clear answer to this that even Escher himself could give, but the important point is not for what purpose MC Escher used mathematics, but with what intrinsic motivation. I believe that the main passion of the artist, who has never received formal mathematics education in any period of his life, is not mathematics, but his goal is to visualize the mysteries such as eternity, creation, cosmos and relativity, which are the main subjects of existential philosophy, in the simplest and most striking way with the help of mathematics. As we approached the end of the lecture period, some of the students in the lecture hall were still listening intently to the presentation, while it was clear from the hum that some of them were distracted. The message came to Blake's cell phone, which he had put on the lectern forgetting to hang up. "Are you free this Saturday?" Simon looked at his watch out of the corner of his eye, turning to the students. "Thank you all for your participation, friends. If anyone has any questions, that's all for today." The two old friends met at Blake's home in Occoquan City, as they often do on weekends, playing chess while having a snack and chatting as they do every time they meet. Located 24 miles from Washington, D.C., Occoquan City is located along the Occoquan River in northern Virginia. Until recently, the town had the appearance of an industrial settlement with tobacco warehouses and mills, but today it has an interesting appearance with antique shops, art centers, restaurants and boat piers. Blake had recently decided to spend his life outside of working hours in a small 2-story villa just on the banks of the river here. This time, the conversation between the two old friends was about to take an unexpected turn. "Where did that come from now?" said Simon Blake, looking at his friend and souring his face. "I didn't know you were interested in these things." "Why not?" said Boris. "Are you the only one reading a book?" He blinked. Boris artificially tries to hide the issue that is haunting him by trying to appear cheerful. The two men had known each other almost since childhood and were quite close friends. After graduating from the same high school, they both began studying art history at the same university. But while Simon continued his education, Boris decided that this was not what he wanted when he completed his first year at the faculty and started the police academy, and was now a major in the Washington Bureau of Research. Simon knew his friend well enough to know that the question he was asking was more than just a conversation, but without saying anything about it, he began to share what he knew. The flood of Noah, as you know, is a great catastrophe which, according to various local legends, is believed to have been sent by God to punish humanity. The details of the flood vary in different cultures and are named in different ways. According to the opinion of the majority, the flood happened around 4100 BC. Although it is generally known as a concept specific to sacred texts, it has actually been included in many mythologies, fables and beliefs before the sacred texts. Naturally, such a widespread belief has also been studied by scientific methods. According to some scientists, such a myth has nothing to do with reality, while others consider it contrary to the laws of physics that the whole world is covered with water, but they find it logical to have a flood in a certain region where only the peoples of the ancient world spread over certain geographies disappeared. In the late 1800s, for example, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley and German archaeologist Erich Schmidt, during their work in the Mesopotamia region, realized that the excavated place was slime when they dug under the ground. In addition, as a result of these excavations, tombs belonging to the Sumerian kings were found in the region. What this means is that there was a great deal of flooding in that very area. This is Google information that can be found everywhere. But if you ask me my personal opinion, the most interesting thing is that the legend of the flood is the only story that has found a place in all religions, all mythologies, all cultures and local narratives as far as I know. I've been interested in it since I was a kid, and I wouldn't be surprised if I learned that the truth of the matter is completely different from what is written on the left and right. Let's see when you get to the main point. Pavlov declined to comment. Blake sipped his coffee from his half-emptied cup, staring at the chessboard in front of him. Simon Blake loved chess and was talented enough in his childhood and youth to aspire to become a professional player. He had spent a lot of effort and time to improve himself in this regard. Although he had to give up his goal of becoming a professional due to some personal problems after winning various rankings from the tournaments he entered at that time, he continued his interest in this game as an amateur, which he was passionate about. His pensive-looking friend had made the game good up to that point, and the location seemed unclear. In the previous move, Boris thought he had gained quality and the upper hand by taking advantage of his friend's gap, but his head was so full that he did not realize that in return for his move, Simon's passing pawns would win the game. The two old friends spent some time like this for a while. 2 hours later, when Simon Blake sent Boris off and closed the door behind him, he knew that the topic of conversation today was not yet closed. Part 18. March 1989. Nearly 2 months had passed since Coleman and Maureen's strange conversation, during which time Coleman telephoned Maureen as often as he should, involuntarily arranged the Institute's physical environment for what was to be done in accordance with the instructions he had received, and informed staff as needed. To an outside eye, things were going on as usual at the Institute for Genome Analysis. In the morning the phone rang. The caller was the one Coleman had guessed. "Here I am, Coleman? My Maureen. Our children prepared the embryo tubes. Is there something missing from you?" "No, everything is arranged the way we talk." "Good. Get the car at the airport at 6 p.m. We'll be there, Odd." Maureen hung up the phone without answering. Part 19. July 19, 1969. Launched from the Kennedy Space Center, Apollo 11 finally entered lunar orbit after a smooth 3-day journey. Collins turned to Armstrong and asked, "Do you think what they're telling us is likely to be true?" Neil Armstrong told his colleague, "Honestly, it doesn't stick to me. But if this possibility were not significant, they would not have gone to all this trouble. Anyway, we'll find out the answer to that in a few hours anyway." Here, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin left Michael Collins in the command module and proceeded to the lunar module, which would land on the lunar surface. However, contrary to what was stated in the official statement to the press and the show program prepared, the lunar module landed on the dark side, not on the moon's sea of silence facing the Earth. The lunar module has begun its journey that will take several miles along the predetermined route. What Armstrong and Aldrin would soon witness was one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Aldrin, with his trembling finger pointing to the image in front of them about 500 meters ahead, said with difficulty, Do you see that too?" He had trouble breathing as he spoke. Armstrong felt his stomach tighten and dizzy. He could only say, "Yes." He could never remember whether he said it out loud or from within. Part 20. Major Pavlov, as a result of his years of experience, thought that there was nothing wrong with bending the rules from time to time for the sake of justice being served, and that sometimes it was the only solution. While this approach had caused him trouble before, things later became sweet. This time he hoped so. A week after he met Selena Armstrong, 2 days had passed since he had visited Blake. It wasn't hard for him the day before to get a fake search warrant and get a report for a cold. At this stage, he did not find it necessary or meaningful to bring up the subject with Blake. Perhaps what happened was just the imagination of a man and a young woman dying of a heart attack. Around 9 a.m. on Tuesday morning, he pulled his car into the parking lot of the Peace Health St. Martin Hospital and started walking to the emergency room. I hope the security guard is not the busybody type. Entering through the narrow entrance on the ground floor on the southwest side of the hospital, he showed the burly young officer who was waiting behind the small desk in front of him on the right hand his ID and the search warrant he held in his left hand, saying, "I, Major Boris Pavlov of the WBI, have been ordered to review the camera footage of the Emergency Services Unit in connection with the death of Colonel Armstrong on November 28, 2021. The security guard, indifferently looking at Pavlov's face and the documents he was holding, said, "Please follow me." After advancing about 20 meters, they entered through the door that read "Authorized Personnel Only" at the entrance. In front of them appeared a narrow corridor lined with doors left and right. The attendant opened the third door from the right, choosing a key from the large key fob with numerous keys hanging on his belt. "Are you going to review the footage here?" Pavlov showed the officer the flash drive he had taken out of his pocket and said, "No, I'll get a copy. It will be examined by an expert team at the center. There's one more thing. I need the name of the taxi driver who brought Armstrong to the hospital that day, the company he worked for, and the statement given by the driver." Part 21. March 1989. The armored vehicle, bearing the logo of the Genome Research Center, arrived at Washington Dulles International Airport long before 6 p.m. that evening. Shortly after, a Dassault Falcon 900 private jet from England landed. Plane's door slowly opened and Odd Maureen appeared. He looked around before going down the stairs. Coleman is nowhere to be found. He got off the plane with 2 other people in black suits watching him. Dr. Ron Kurt of the Genome Research Center noticed that the driver and 2 other officers were waiting for him. "Hi Ronnie, I thought Nathan was coming to meet me." Dr. Kurt tried to appear as friendly as he could, saying, "Welcome Maureen, Dr. Coleman has an urgent problem that he needs to deal with at the last moment, for which he has asked me to give you his apologies. He is now impatiently waiting for you in the Institute building." Maureen stared straight at him. "I'm sure it is." Dr. Kurt asked curiously, "Is our cargo on the plane, sir?" Maureen turned her head toward the plane behind her, making eye contact with her men staring at her as if waiting for news. He raised his hand and snapped his finger. "Of course, Ronnie." Dr. Kurt directed his men to help unload the cargo on the plane and transport it to the armored vehicle. 10 minutes later, the Institute vehicle in front and the black limousine prearranged for Maureen behind it were on its way to the Genome Research Center with the mysterious cargo inside. Part 22. Boris Pavlov, after receiving the necessary information from the security guard, first went to his home, where he could easily examine the video recordings. It was easier than I expected. After getting himself a coffee from the kitchen, he turned on his laptop and copied the H.264 format camera recordings that he loaded into his flash memory from the DVR recorder in the hospital. After completing the backup process, he opened the images by taking himself a coffee and pen and paper. He first opened the recordings that displayed the exterior of the emergency room in hopes of being able to see the taxi that brought Armstrong to the hospital. Soon after, a Ford Crown Victoria taxi appeared on the screen. At this point, Pavlov froze the image. He took out of his pocket the small notebook in which he wrote down the driver's name, Cliff Robbins. He continued to watch the camera recording. Vehicle stops in front of the hospital at exactly 5:27 a.m. on November 28, 2021. The driver's door of the taxi opens and the driver, who appears to be red-haired despite the fact that the image is black and white, emerges. So that's our man. Up to this point, everything seemed normal. But after a few seconds, something happened that caught Pavlov's attention. After the driver got out of the vehicle, he stood in front of the vehicle in cold blood for a while, instead of rushing inside as he normally should. He looked left and right, just moving his eyes expressionlessly as if he was looking for someone or something. His eyes fixed in one spot. Raising his right hand slightly, he pointed pointedly at his own neck with his index finger. After a few seconds, he continued to look at the same spot with his eyes, moving his head up and down vaguely as if approving something. Immediately afterwards, as if he had just been there, he hurriedly started running inside and exited the image.